Thank you. It's such a pleasure to get to talk to you about this in this way, and it's such a pleasure to be at this stage of conversation about the marriage question in the Constitution, which in so many respects in this conversation is sort of settled. You know, there's no debate about it. But like I remember going back, and this is what when we started speaking about this committee in private session, my first concern is about the wording and what's going to work vis-a-vis the rest of the Constitution, and what's going to work as a piece, as a question to the people. And it's a very sort of practical approach. I agree with all of the motivations behind everything. So my questions are driven by a need to try to reach a practical solution as quickly as possible. But I'm minded about what Julie said about, you know, the Children and Family Relationships Act, and just how the Constitution is, and the swathe of constitutional change in this area builds on each other. You're quite right that there's been no real assessment that I'm aware of or intersection between Article 42A and the question of the family. And in some respects, you know, maybe that was the trick missed back in 2012 in respect of the Article 42A. When you look at how it came, I mean, the motivation there, of course, was to give children rights in and of themselves, to separate those rights from those of their family and their parents, where they had been derivative from, essentially, in the first instance, and to provide for concepts that we wanted, like best interest and voice of the child. There was no question at the time of changing. It was all, you know, there wasn't a question. It was about overcoming the barrier of Article 40, family, rather than anything else. And when you say then about the Children and Family Relationships Act, which preceded the marriage equality referendum, and which I believe in many respects paved the way for the success of that referendum, because the children question had been taken out for all intents and purposes for the debate, actually privately, because I was in the negotiation around it, we were trying to convince that the question was, how was the Children and Family Relationships Bill 2014, as it then was, how was that constitutionally compatible when the Civil Partnerships Bill and Civil Partnerships Act in 2009 hadn't been? If you recall, that act had simply left children out in every respect. And the argument that was made with the Attorney General's office, and which won, was that the thing that was different now was the existence of Article 42A, that children were constitutional right holders of themselves. So the 2008 position no longer persisted, and we were in a different situation. Ergo, the bill got through the Attorney General's office, passed, and I think made a big difference for the referendum. So that's the sort of the sequence of how things have been built. But I think it's important, because how those things, it's important just to go through that, because how it now interacts is crucial as well. So when you go back, and I listen to the different wording and the different motivations, it seems, okay, obviously what we're agreed on essentially is the provision for family equality, generally removing the question of marriage as being relevant, essentially, as you say, Ms. Gibney, being based on relationships, which is of course what it is. The question about a positivist statement or otherwise in relation to gender, and a positivist statement or otherwise in relation to care, and if and so how that's framed, where, you know, its relative importance. And I completely agree with you, Ms. McCarthy and other speakers, about the absence of gender equality and the need for a normative positive statement in itself. Of course, we don't want to have that. But I wonder as well, when we talk about the practicalities of winning the referendum, how much are we going to get from, and this is the tension, how much are we going to get from the inclusion of that statement in practical constitutional terms, in a way that reflects an obligation on legislation and in the courts, in real terms, versus making a more neutral statement that we can legislate within and under, that's compatible with the rest of the Constitution. And I just don't know the answer to that. And it's a sort of I can see Professor Fennell going, well, maybe, I don't know.
I think it's a really, really good question, and it's a really big issue. And of course, I'm minded here that we were in a position where the Citizens' Assembly came down in favour of this. So I suppose that's influencing me to a certain extent. But I think you're exactly right. That's the conundrum. And I won't answer the question. I don't have a definitive answer other than what my views that I kind of expressed earlier. But there is one thing that we shouldn't miss, though, it seems to me, or one possible danger, and that relates to the care provision and the statement there. That cannot become another Article 41(2). It can't be linked, and there is a small danger there that in a sense that the highlighting of care and the care responsibility, that can't feed a narrative that is stereotypical.
I totally agree.
That's very important.
I totally agree with that. And I just wonder how the various iterations of wording may get to that. And of course, as Ms. O'Connor said, so much of this debate and so much of this effort is about a major cultural change in respect of how we perceive care and the care obligation and the care, the joy of care, but particularly for women, and how that relates to children and how that impacts them over time. But when we come to the wording, and when you come to the wording vis-a-vis the rest of the Constitution and how that sits together, it's not to be in conflict, it's really just to try to identify how this is going to work best. I'm extremely practical, and I just want to get something that's going to A, be effective, and B, win. And it's to try to achieve that. I was looking at Ms. Kiernan and the wording proposed, and did you say, I'm sorry, Walsh? I heard Walsh.
Judy Walsh.
Judy Walsh. I'd be so interested to hear from her and her background. Again, there's so much in it, and as a constitutional provision, it's so desirable. But as a standalone constitutional provision, it has so many new words in it that aren't constitutionally tested, that don't have a read across with the rest of the words in the Constitution, that I know would cause problems when it comes to getting it through the Attorney General's office and how all of that sits together. And I suppose my question would be is, how do we take something of that kind? And I think there's a slight contradiction. I know it's compatible with Article 42A, but there's a slight contradiction because it's about you've got to provide for, you can in fact interfere with the family, as Article 42A provides. But really what I'm saying is there's an awful lot that's desirable in that. It's about taking something of that nature and distilling into something that's compatible with the other words, that has not untested words that would throw up other things. Not be against that entirely. It's just that you just need to be sure of what you're doing when you're putting forward the amendment. And maybe we can speak more with other drafters just about getting it and finessing that. I'm sorry, that's more of a contribution than a series of questions. But would anybody like to
I might ask the Orla from the National Women's Council to come back in on this issue.
Yeah, Jennifer, you might have something to say, but just I suppose, I think you're going to the heart of some of the issues that are going to come out in a referendum, and that we need to be really clear on in terms of going into a referendum. The one thing about the non-discrimination clause, or whatever way we want to term that, the explicit reference to gender equality and non-discrimination, from our look at what's happened in other constitutions, in our view, there is a strong enough argument there that can have a really positive practical implication. Okay. So, like we mentioned things, for example, in the Austrian one, that led to a very strong case around gender budgeting, for example. That there's high-level pieces that can come from that principled inclusion in a constitution. So I think that is important, and obviously that has to be communicated very clearly, but that there is enough there in our view that this could make it, that this has the potential to make a difference. And also because it is trying to, I suppose, really challenge society and bring us forward in terms of where we are now with regard to women. And I think that was so much at the essence of the Citizens' Assembly, of feeling that, which Deputy Smith mentioned earlier, Magdalene Laundry's piece, that we've come to a point of wanting to make a really positive statement about where we are in relation to women, and that I think that's part of the impetus between, for putting something like that in. Now, Jennifer.
Yeah, no, sorry. Yeah, I think obviously when you're talking about a constitution, we want to be careful about how constitutional sections interact with each other, but there's quite simple statements that can be made. Many European constitutions or basic laws, or whatever their own language is, do make relatively simple statements, and even in terms of, say, the EU Charter of Fundamental Rights, there's good models, I think, that can be looked at, that we can consider for incorporation, that wouldn't perhaps have they would have knock-on effects in terms of what we're actually seeking to achieve, but wouldn't necessarily have too many negative impacts. I suppose just in terms of the language with 41.2, I suppose we would be very, very much of the position that there's been a number of examinations of that language, and consistently the Irish citizens don't want that deleted. They want it amended. They want it kept. They want the sexism deleted, but they want care kept in the Constitution, and that's come through a number of times. So I think the wording that we've been proposing, that that's here and was in our submission, is wording that we have worked on over a number of iterations since 2013. And on each occasion it's been put to a group of, say, non-policy wonks. They have agreed, yes, that's what they would like to see. So I suppose that language we feel is fairly robustly tested now in a couple of places. And language around the non-discrimination and gender equality is fairly robustly tested across European constitutions. And then I suppose we would defer to the expertise of our colleagues around the family about examining that. But there's certainly emergent norms in Irish society supporting conceptualisations of family that are not marital, that are about interdependence, care, love, support.
I've no doubt about that. I actually think that's the more straightforward piece.
Sure.
To be honest with you.
All
That's
right.
not, I don't think that would be
Thanks.